I'm going to highlight two main things that kind of come out of this, which number one, of course, is the big, beautiful bill, which is now passed, and we'll talk briefly about what some of that means. And then we'll also talk briefly about the tariff focus, which started to shift a little bit here in this afternoon. We have a main focus this week around the Fed minutes as we kind of highlight what was covered there in the most recent press conference and the meeting that was just before. And we will also touch briefly on some of the administration's focus as we look into the summer months around both tariffs and the new tax bill that was passed. My name is Brandon Steele, financial advisor with Mainsail Financial Group, and our goal every week is to leave you feeling more empowered and hopefully weed out some of the noise along the way of all the market news, data, and trends that we're watching. So keep in mind, this week was a little bit of a shorter week. The markets were closed, or I'm sorry, this week is a full week. Last week we had a bit of a shorter week with the markets closed on Friday, but really not a whole lot of data to speak to at the moment. There are some bigger items to talk about, which we'll get to in our question of the week around the administration's focus. But for now, really what we wanted to cover is the Fed minutes on Wednesday that were released. So keep in mind, this is from the meeting back in June, but the minutes of that meeting were released. And honestly, there's not a whole lot to write home about. It's kind of what we had covered right after the press conference in general, which is that most of the members do anticipate some degree of Fed cuts this year. But the key is that when those cuts happen and how many cuts ultimately do take place through 2025 vary pretty significantly from member to member. So just kind of a very polarizing view across the Fed on when and how many cuts and what that might look like. But if we're going to summarize it for a general theme, the majority do believe that there will be some degree of cuts this year. It seems from these minutes that it's very unlikely that we see a cut in the next meeting. That meeting is coming up on July 30th for the press conference and the decision. So we'll keep you posted, obviously, as we get closer to that Fed meeting. But it seems very unlikely from the minutes that we would see a cut in that meeting unless there's some really clear data suggesting that it's necessary. That said, there are a few that did think that they should cut as soon as possible. Very few. So this is not the majority by any means, but there is still a couple folks that are, leaning towards that direction. So we'll keep an eye on it. Again, if there is any data that would really suggest a cut is necessary, it could change all of this, but I think it's very unlikely at the moment anyways, from what we're seeing in the minutes and some of the data that's come out since, that we would see a cut in that July decision and press conference there. Before I get to the question of the week, which is where we're going to spend most of our time, be sure to tune in next Thursday. Speaking of the Fed minutes and what's going on, we actually have CPI and PPI, so inflation data, coming out next week, as well as retail sales on Thursday. So we'll be sure to catch up on all the data from there. But before we break for this week, we have a great question of the week from Doug, which is really about the administration's focus now. And I'm going to highlight two main things that kind of come out of this, which number one, of course, is the big, beautiful bill, which is now passed, and we'll talk briefly about what some of that means. And then we'll also talk briefly about the tariff focus, which started to shift a little bit here in this first full week of July. So first, I'll touch on the tariffs. So one thing I'll mention here, that the biggest thing really at the moment is that the tariff deadlines were pushed to August 1st. Those were meant to be July 9th. So just yesterday on Wednesday was supposed to be the deadline. This was pushed back to August 1st. Whether that holds or not, obviously only time will tell. But for now, the deadline for getting some of these things figured out is August 1st. Now, with that, and I think this is a little less important because we have seen that there likely will be changes in negotiations and, all the tactics involved with that over time. But there have been some conversations about ultimately where these tariffs might land. And there's a couple things to address. Some letters have gone out. The main areas and focus, main countries in focus right now are really Brazil and India, it seems, at the moment. Obviously, that will change week to week as things unfold. But right now, those were the two big headline countries that we were watching, with Brazil getting kind of a big increase on their potential tariffs. And then India, it sounds like maybe coming to the table, but nonetheless, trying to see how that impacts things, because of course, how meaningful they are and how their growth has really impacted things. This thing is that the deadline was now pushed to August 1st, but here, this is some of the in-between as well, in case that helps. The other thing that I did want to cover is the Big Beautiful Bill Act. So basically, there's a couple of things I want to highlight, and this is going to be a really high level view of it, but there are some key areas that I think are most important to touch on in terms of how it affects planning. So one of them, the biggest thing is, like, to wrap this up in a nutshell, it basically extended the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So that's the simplest way to put this. Now, that said, there are some changes to that as well. One of them is that it did increase the SALT limits, which is state and local tax limits for deductions. So that went from 10,000 to 40,000. So that is pretty important, especially if, for folks who do have a lot of those state and local taxes that they maybe weren't able to take advantage of prior to these new limits being increased. The standard deduction did increase slightly. There's also a deduction available to seniors. So for those 65 and older, again, based on some factors, but nonetheless, there are some additional deductions that may be available. Bonus depreciation came back into the mix. And then overtime and tips are also not taxable for some individuals and families. So there's the key to be aware of here with all of this is that there are certain limitations. There are certain folks that may or may not qualify based on income and otherwise. But nonetheless, hopefully this gives you kind of a very high level view of some of the maybe larger changes that came out of the Big Beautiful Bill. Other thing I will mention that may be helpful for many of you, that if you have 529 accounts that are open, there also may be a little more flexibility in terms of how those funds could be used, more so for K through 12 education expenses. So it may not necessarily open things up entirely for older children, but it may give a little more flexibility for younger kids as well. So hopefully that helps. Great question from Doug, and a lot to cover. So again, this is a very high level view, but definitely let us know if you have more questions and we can try and address those more directly. Be sure to tune in next Thursday. Again, we're going to cover inflation as well as retail sales. In the meantime, have a great upcoming weekend, and we'll see you next Thursday at 3.